Hello everyone and welcome to today's seminar. Great to see so many of you joined us today. I've just been looking down the chat about all the different places that you've joined from, so welcome everybody, no matter where you are. Keep that chat going, make some new connections today, and maybe follow up with some people and connect in with them on LinkedIn, so keep that conversation going. We want to make this session as interactive as possible, so use the chat to give us your feedback as we're going along, but also if you want to put a question to our panel or anyone today, then please put it in the Q&A box. Don't leave it all to the last minute. I'll try to get through as many as possible, but the earlier you get them in, the more likely that I am to get to them. So we are, this session today is our second in a series that we are doing with RS Components. Thank you again to RS for being a massive supporter of CIPS and supporting us on this seminar series. If you missed the first one, don't worry, because they're all recorded. We're recording this one. We can send you a copy of the previous recording. You'll also receive a copy of this recording as well, so you can watch back or share with your colleagues afterwards. So any more housekeeping from me? I think that is it. So without further ado, we'll get started, and I'm going to introduce Kate Davies, who's Head of Commercial Services at Electrocomponents, who are part of RS Components, and she's going to be joining me first of all we'll have a little chat before we introduce the rest of our panel. Hi Kate, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi Emma, hello everyone.
Great to have you here. So Kate, start by telling me a little bit about your role and the work that you do.
I think I've got probably the longest, flashiest job title.
Have you? Go on, go for it. It's always a bit of a competition, isn't it, with job titles?
Title in procurement, but certainly it's up there, I think. But essentially I'm responsible for indirect procurement. So everything that's not inventory that goes into our warehouses and is distributed to our customers. And that covers all traditional procurement categories. So we've got logistics, marketing, technology, corporate and professional services, and obviously a lot of resonance with today's topic because an awful lot of disruption and uncertainty about resilience in our supply chains that hit every category under our indirect procurement banner for sure.
Yeah, so we're here to talk about building supply chain resilience, particularly in that indirect spend. What kind of challenges do your customers face when it comes to managing total cost of ownership?
I think the key challenge really is around understanding what's going on. So around insight and really getting to grips with either upstream or downstream some of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. So it's not necessarily just the immediate risks. Those tend to be the ones where we've got quite a lot of experience, but really looking to build networks to really understand beneath the surface of whatever goods or service it is that we're procuring. From a total cost of ownership point of view, I know that it's probably spoken about in every board for every member that's joined the conversation today. And cost to serve or total cost of ownership really does play a part in creating competitive advantage. So it's great that procurement can really support and lead the way in delivering strategy that reduces that moving forwards.
Excellent. And how can digital technology help overcome some of these challenges and drive greater efficiencies?
I think we're all very keen to understand compliance and risk management within the sphere of procurement. Without tools, this feels like an incredibly manual job, doesn't it, for all of us? And it can be a bit of a distraction. So I think technology has a significant role to play in allowing all procurement professionals to refocus on where the value add is. And enables us also to share between procurement managers or procurement teams, and also to explain exactly where the challenges are to the rest of the business, and gather some passion and some motivation to go and work through those challenges together.
I guess it's helped, hasn't it? Because the boardroom have been knocking on our doors more than ever during these uncertain times. So having that information and data to our fingertips has been even more critical than ever.
Absolutely. We're certainly heavily investing in technology over the coming years, and continuing our automation journey as well to make it more accessible for stakeholders across the business to access procurement support and procurement talent.
Yeah, and I keep hearing that, you know, of all the projects that people have had to drop, whether that's due to financial constraints or just time, digital isn't one that's naturally being dropped and in fact accelerated and driven forward. So yeah, for those very reasons. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Kate. At this point, I'd like to introduce the rest of our panel. So you've got a great panel. Kate's going to continue to join us today. Also joining us, we have Patrick Dunn from Sainsbury's, CPO at Sainsbury's. Hi, Patrick. We have Alan Hartley, who's Head of Procurement and Supply Chain Delivery at Sellafield. And we have Dan Cameron, who's former CPO at Quilter. So we have a real mixture of people's experience and backgrounds and working in different sectors today. So thank you all for joining us today. It's great to have you on board.
Okay.
So I thought I'd just start off by putting quite an open question to you all. And Dan, I'll add this one to you first, if that's okay. So just talking about what kind of issues you've been facing when it comes to managing indirect spend and how you've been overcoming some of these challenges.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. I think at the moment we could spend about 5 hours just laying out all the issues that are going on in supply chains, etc. And some of them we've seen before, some of them are very new to us. I think one thing I do want to say, though, it's worth saying they probably pale into insignificance given the context of what's going on in world events. So when we think about our challenge, I think we need to put it in that context. But anyway, perhaps get back to the question. I think as I talk to colleagues and peers across various organisations, there are a few sort of headlines that jump out in terms of things they're wrestling with. So clearly inflation, inflationary pressures, I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's front and centre for everybody in terms of how we manage the kind of price, cost and budgets within our organisations. I think linked with that, on the other side of the equation, the sort of risk and ESG, it's not an issue per se, but it's a growing requirement, an expectation of regulators, boards, other stakeholders to be able to address and be able to report and drive that conversation. So I think that's something we've really got to wrestle with. And then perhaps the third one I'll call out is the sort of war on talent, not only within the procurement team, but actually from vendors, and how do you get good resources? We've got many projects across our organizations that are requiring, the A team from some of these vendors to actually make them happen and make them perform. And at the moment, it's really difficult to secure them. And there's a real competition out there. So being agile about how we get hold of that talent and secure it is really important to our collective success. Mm. So perhaps some of the ways of overcoming those, and then I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will add in and chip into this. I think never more than now being able to forecast and predict a little bit into the future, and therefore secure some of that resource and demand is really important. And indeed, from a cost perspective, I think that's going to be really front and center for us to be able to do that. But at the same time, being able to have really strong relationships with our suppliers and be able to meet changes in demand. If the last 2 years has taught us anything, the plan we have could go straight out of the window on sort of day 2. So being able to flex that and change our plans and have really loyal, strong relationships who are able to do that with us is a really important part of our supply chain. And then final two kind of macro things, if I can. One is, let's embrace some of this pressure. Rather than try and fix the way we've done stuff historically, this might be the catalyst for us to do something really different and make a real step change. So sometimes let's lean into that issue or pressure and use it to our advantage. And then also there's a whole host of technologies and disruptive organizations out there who are not only fun to deal with, but actually have got some really cool solutions to some of the issues we're facing. So maybe cast our net a little bit wider in terms of who we go and engage with and talk to solve some of these issues. Anyway, I'll stop there and perhaps invite some of the other panel to have a chat.
Patrick, tell us a bit about some of the challenges that you guys have been facing at Sainsbury's.
Well, the first thing I would say, Emma, is, being in this industry for 30 years, every 5 or 10 years, we had a major event. 1996, you had the Euro, not the Euro finals, no, I mean the introduction of the Euro, but and then you had Y2K when we thought every computer was up, 1999 on the 31st December. And then 2008, but where I'm leading to is, over the last 2.5 years, we've had the pandemic. And so that brought a whole amazing amount of activity to make everybody safe. And And leading from that was the labor issues that brought, and so truck drivers and warehouse operatives, and so I think procurement has been managing, you had the Suez Canal come after that, and now you have sea freight issues and challenges, but of course overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. But is also the war in itself is a tragedy unfolding in front of us, but the fundamental challenges it brings in itself, sanctions on Russia. At the minute in Sainsburys, we're looking into not just our primary, secondary, tertiary supply chains. We're peeling the onion to understand any connections into Russia, both from a supply chain risk perspective, but also from a sanctions and trying to do our part. But as Daniel was saying, what are the upsides in all of this? I think people in procurement over the last 2 to 3 years are getting more experiences than probably people have taken 20 years to experience. Now that can be quite daunting. That's very frightening. You're getting inflationary challenges now that people haven't seen for 10 or 15 years. But I would see it as a learning curve as well, And we'll come on later to talk about some of the implications of how do you manage raw material inflation and stuff. But if I had one piece of advice for those with the experience, who've experienced things like this before, step forward and bring the past to what's happening now, and help those that haven't experienced it, because it is all manageable. It has happened before, and it can be quite a good learning experience actually, and it can accelerate your career in so many ways. As I say, every 5 or 10 years an event like the inflation we're having now happens, but inflation, supply chain issues, war, and pandemic, is just a lot.
It's just
it can get you down, but the reality is it can also be an exciting time as well, actually, to learn and make your career really.
Yeah, Alan, I could see you agreeing with a lot of what Patrick said there. A similar story from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember Fukushima. I can't remember the actual date, but I was at Urenco at the time, and it decimated the nuclear ambition globally. It really put the pause button on the nuclear industry, but everybody else took a different view that it wasn't going to impact them, but it actually took out the wafer fabs right across that coastline. And people saying it's not going to impact us, it'll impact the technology market. How many items do we buy these days that don't have microchips embedded in them? And also the supply chain, the dependency on new technology and microchips as well. So I always say to my team, expect the unexpected. So when the news started to surface around coronavirus from China back in late November, early December, I got my team around that then. And it wasn't looking at our tier ones, it was looking right down our supply chain and saying, what's going to happen? What's coming down the pipe that we're not going to be aware of? So we started to monitor our suppliers in terms of health from 24 hours through to a 130-day timeline to ensure that we had a safe, secure, resilient supply chain. Because the impact to us of one of our key and critical suppliers going down is much more significant from a cost and impact perspective, not just to us, but to government, to the environment, to the taxpayer. So we needed to make sure that we were right on point from day one once the news started to emerge. And the only way you can do that, as well as just having the conversations with these suppliers, and I don't just mean how are things kind of suppliers, really robust, challenging conversations, are using technology. So we were using things like Resilink, which was giving us deep insight through our supply chain, actually going right through to source, giving us geopolitical insight into what's actually happening, looking at scarcity of materials. And it's even giving us now intelligence around cyber attacks, because we want to make sure that if there is an issue within our supply chain, that we've got the biggest window of opportunity to identify alternative sources and services to enable us to maintain safe and secure operations, which is absolutely paramount to us, because the cost would be much bigger if we had a supply failure. So, and we also use things like rapid ratings that give us significant intelligence around financial fragility and financial health of our suppliers, and equip our procurement and buyers with the right kind of questions to go and ask suppliers way ahead of the curve in terms of, what are you up to? We see this happening. What are you doing about it? Those questions that previously our people would have to formulate themselves, based on trying to read difficult financial reports. They get simple reports and great question sets to equip them to ask the right questions. So technology is proving to be extremely useful for us. And that's before we even get into the landscape of supply relationship management.
Excellent. Dan, you had your hand up there. Were you going to make an extra point there?
No, I think I'm still wrestling with my clever iPad that if I wave, it puts my
Oh,
hand up
okay.
for me. So
Don't worry, no problem.
digital.
No worries. Kate, similar story for you in your role.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of the challenges that have already been discussed. So the war on talent, particularly for the positioning of indirect procurement in electric components, because we all need to access capabilities. And for many years now, we've had growing trends around consultancy and capability building that aren't necessarily within the talent of the organisation. And I think it really does put a spotlight on the availability of that talent, but also it's encouraging us to think differently. So to Patrick's point, it's a fantastic opportunity to really learn more about the sectors that you're procuring in, and to leverage the knowledge of others. One of the things that we've been working a lot more on is to create space for problem solving, because I think that it's often quite a knee-jerk reaction, and the business that we support ultimately can have that knee-jerk reaction too, and that can create us to move more towards panicking and that overwhelm that's discussed. So bringing it back to centre, prioritising, making sure that we've got one eye on the future as well, because we need to deal with the risks of today, but actually over the next 12 to 24 months, the amount of uncertainty we've got, we need to be prepared for all different eventualities.
Absolutely, and making time for that thinking time and reflecting, I think, is really critical. It's so easy to have this knee-jerk reaction to things. So yeah, really great point there. Patrick, you touched on kind of inflation, rising cost of raw materials, shipping issues, etc. Those costs will inevitably feed through to business and onto consumers as well. What strategies are there for procurement teams to take better control of indirect spend in that area? What can we do?
The first thing I'd say is we're very much a consumer business, and so customers vote whether they shop with us or not based on the prices that they experience. So there's a huge pressure on us to try and keep the inflation managed and keep it out for as long as possible, keep it out of our consumers' pockets. But there is a lot of things you can do. You know, the immediate things, of course, is secure supply. You know, you need to understand where the criticality is in your supply chain, but also the economics of that supply. Because there's, you know, if I look at my own business for Argos, for instance, there's a price at which there's no point in shipping it because actually consumers won't pay for it. And so, you know, so reviewing the economics and the criticality. I think thirdly, I would look at your legal contracts for those critical components. You know, bringing in inflation is one thing, but the war as well in Ukraine, you know, force majeure can come into play. Cyber attacks as well, you know, just making sure your legal contracts are understood as to when can a supplier pull in the contract and review it, basically. And then a few other things that, you know, over different industries have used, you know, material escalators and currency escalators, you know, are a great tool at this point in time, whereby you have an agreement with a vendor, but you know that certain commoditized materials are hyperinflating. And so a way of managing it is you can't ignore it, or else you'll end up in a very bad place with your supply base. But you can take that element of the cost and turn it to your advantage. One is you put in an escalator whereby you baseline what the contract was established at, and you move the currency escalator or the material escalator within set parameters with your vendor. Why is that important? For two reasons. One is it'll go back to the base case whenever you get it there, because, you know, we all know in procurement, you agree a cost increase, it may never come out again. And so looking at those escalators and making sure you're tracking them. But secondly, getting your vendors to explain to you their cost breakdown as to why you need this cost. Having many years of vendors not wanting to tell you what their true costs are, now they have to justify. And so try and turn it to its advantage through cost breakdowns and so forth. But always remember that you're in this for the medium to long term. There'll be sometimes you're put under pressure for short-term decision making that could damage your long-term relationship. And then I think it's sometimes not the best strategy to stick your head in the sand and ignore it, even though the vendor is struggling, because that could create a lot of other issues. But as I say, understand the criticality of your supply, your commodities, and understand the economics of when it becomes uneconomical to actually source that. And then finally, I'm sure everybody will know dual sourcing, near sourcing, looking at the medium term, your sourcing strategies where you can actually make a difference. You could move to a higher manufacturing cost base because the shipping and logistics is now more affordable than a lower cost base, but has a high shipping cost. Turkey's a great country at the moment that we're looking, have been sourcing over the last few years, instead of Far East Asia. So yeah, a lot to do, but have a look at material currency escalators as a way of negotiating with your vendors, that you're staying within parameters, and so that when those parameters come back to normality, you get back to normal contract conditions again.
Alan, similar story?
Yeah, it is a similar story for us as well. I mean, one of the things that we learned very quickly at Sellafield is you can be busy fools trying to chase every dime. Careful. And it's what are those relationships or sources of goods and supply that really matter to you. So we segmented our supply chain across 4 levels. We spend 1.2 billion of our 2.4 billion funding with the supply chains for 50%. And what astonished us, by applying a great segmentation tool to our goods and services, more so than suppliers, we identified that 20 relationships, and I call them relationships because some of those are partnerships, actually account for 900 million of our 1.2 billion spend. So that's where we needed to focus our attention in terms of those relationships to make sure that they were robust and we were having the right conversations. But in addition to that, one of the other things that we did is, if you've ever worked in an organization that's steeped in history, very technically orientated, what you find is that they've almost ignored what's going on in other sectors. So we developed an approach, and I introduced it at AstraZeneca, then Urenco, and then more recently Sellafield, of externalization. And that's about, as Kate said, it's about building that great, robust external network in different sectors, not your own sector, but different sectors. Because if you speak to the supply chain, they will only tell you what they know or what they can do, not what's happening elsewhere. If you create that great network that you can tap into and go and see solutions in action, it helps you accelerate along the knowledge curve, avoid the mistakes of others, and unlock value at pace. Because you'll see it, you'll know what it looks like, you know what the supply chain looks like that can deliver those kind of solutions. You can come back into your business, you can take them to see solutions in action. You can drive decisions very quickly and then execute amazing solutions. And that's before you get anywhere near supplier relationship management. But supplier relationship management is so key to sustaining your cost base and looking at where improvements can be made in other areas in order to mitigate increases in certain areas. So segmentation was key there. So identifying those top 20 relationships was the starting point for us. And we didn't segment in isolation as commercial people. We did it in partnership with our operational counterparts. And it's surprising, if you do it in isolation and you do it in partnership, you will get 2 very different results. And it's important that segmentation drives the right key and critical suppliers, goods and services for your actual business. So we did that, and we embarked on a significant supplier relationship management program with those 20 relationships. And it realigned those relationships to the key drivers of our business, which is secure supply chain and budget certainty, because we are funded on an annual basis. So it also meant that those relationships were quite aware of where we needed to turn them up and turn them down from a funding constraint perspective. So it built the agility into that kind of relationship. And sitting down with those organizations and developing joint business plans really did surface some great new opportunities about where we could drive more efficiencies and unlock value that we hadn't seen before, to the extent where it unlocked somewhere in the region of about 20 to 30 million of value above the contract line. we wouldn't have seen before without SRM enabling us to do that. But you do need good technology underneath that. You know, SRM is about people and it's about relationships, but you need an underlying technology platform, and we use one called Supplier Base, which enables us to look at the suppliers against their unique value proposition and enables us to drive value from continuous improvement, innovation, risk management, etc. And that's been so important to us to drive in success through those relationships.
Excellent. We'll come on to technology in a bit. Thanks, Alan. Kate, a lot of that I could see resonated with you too on, and going back to what Patrick said at the beginning, we may not have been through a pandemic before in history, but we've been through other things, and how can you learn from them, and how can you also learn from other organizations doing a similar thing? What kind of things have you done in terms of addressing these rising costs?
For me, I think it's about going back to basics. So it's really understanding the demand. So even before this comes to procurement and we start to really get involved about how to deliver and facilitate delivery of strategy, understanding where your organisation is going. I cannot put enough emphasis on that, because that is the point about the long term. And it helps you to manage relationships according to that. It's fair to say we're still on a journey from a perspective of SRM. But I think that the other point here I'd like to make is that's a source of differentiator for your team. And to take things in bite-sized chunks and not be overwhelmed by the scale of change and the pace of change and the problems. But actually a lot of what I've noticed across my career, the problems and the solutions, there are similar themes. And actually when you start to really break that down, and Alan makes a great point, working with the business, you cannot underestimate the strength of the networks that different functions have, and the valuable insight that they bring to the table. It's also not to be underestimated the power of suppliers networks as well. And that can work in your favor or it can work against you, depending on, the touch points that they've had to date with procurement. I always like to think of when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's probably because of inertia, and it means we need to get out and speak to other people. And that's to me is the best way to solve any problem. And whether that's talent and getting closer to talent acquisition teams, understanding human resources, or whether it's some of the challenges that we've got with oil and gas and linked to utilities and almost everything that's bearing down on the levers and the pressures that we're experiencing at the moment. Nothing for me steps us further away than trying to solve a problem by yourself. So get out there and speak to as many people as possible.
And Dan, I mean, you've worked in completely different sectors, the service sector, etc. Are the issues still the same? Are the mechanisms the same? What kind of challenges have you seen in terms of that hyperinflation and rising costs?
Yeah, I think I sort of want to build on Kate's point. I think the fact is because it's impacting indirect spend as well as a specific kind of raw material or particular sector, we are kind of all in this together. So actually the power of the community and people out there, and one thing I've learned from my 20 odd years in procurement, that we do like to talk to each other. So there's lots of sharing that does go on. So it's, I really encourage people to go and pick up the phone and go and have a coffee and actually learn from what other people are doing, because it is definitely a transferable set of knowledge that people can leverage in their own industry. So that's absolutely the case. I think Alan was talking about it in terms of the SRM piece. The one thing I'd say there is what's been most effective for me is being, it doesn't always come naturally to us, is to be really transparent and open with the supply chain and talk about what you're trying to achieve rather than just a specific about that relationship. It's the bigger picture. What is our organization trying to achieve, and how can that partner relationship bring its best foot forward to solve it for us? Because it might be a slightly different answer than the question we've been asking. So I think where we can just be really sort of open the kimono, if you like, and talk about what we're trying to do as an organization, how they can bring their best foot forward and help. And then I think I mentioned it earlier on, there's some super interesting kind of technology and organizations out there who are just tackling some of these issues in a really different way, and where we get these mega events that totally change the dynamic of what we're looking at. And we're talking double-digit inflation potentially coming. We need to think differently, and there's real appetite to perhaps take some different approaches, which, when it's 1-2%, people aren't necessarily interested in taking that plunge. So again, I think it's the opportunity to really investigate some new ways of working, new technologies, new organizations, but absolutely in parallel, as Alan said, around the existing key relationships which drive the majority of our supply chain. So yeah, I think lots of similarity in the conversations, but openness is probably the key thing I'd sort of stress.
Building on that, Kate, if I could ask you first, we've talked about the need for stronger relationships, more partnerships, perhaps. What can we do to foster these more partnership agreements? What interventions do we have to do? What should we be looking at to build a more resilient supply chain?
I think this is where I cringe, because I think we've all had experiences of where it's not necessarily gone quite so well. So for me, and sitting and thinking about this, it's about being reliable, because you need to build trust. And to Daniel's point about being open, you can't build trust if you let an agreement and you walk away from that and you don't understand then how it's implemented. And also some of the challenges in that early life of a new agreement or any new relationship. I think there's always that saying as well that we all quote around, if you've got to go back to the contract, you've already lost. Something's clearly broken down. And I think so regular touch points, keeping involved. I have also been involved, in previous organizations, we ran huge engagement programs where we literally had 1 page per category of the problem that we were trying to solve. I think this comes back to some really key shifts away from being over specific about the answer to the question and really letting suppliers demonstrate their capability around how they're going to deliver goods and services to us, rather than necessarily telling them exactly what you want, because it's a shared problem. Most of what is happening at the moment, it doesn't just impact us, it impacts our suppliers just as much. And just having that truly honest conversation to say, look, we're in this together. Removing the threat, I think, from some of your strategic suppliers, that you are looking around and really trying to foster the relationship first, demonstrate that you've gone through a logical process to really break that down. I think it is certainly the more strategic view. I think also, and I do appreciate the point Alan made around embedding technology, because we can all be busy fools and we can all distract ourselves. But bringing everything back to center around, we've got a shared common objective. It's amazing what walls that breaks down, and in quite a quick time, particularly if the suppliers are up against exactly the same problems that we are.
Yeah. Alan, partnerships with suppliers is most certainly not a new thing whatsoever. But do they need to be deeper and more transparent? Are we having to have more of them? Is how manageable is that? What's the view from you? What's your changes in relationships in your supply chain been like over the last few years?
I think it's absolutely critical. The supply chain is so intrinsically linked to the success of our organization and the delivery of our mission that we have to invest in those relationships. We need to regard them as an extension of our own organization and invest in them accordingly, the same way as we invest in our people. As Kate said, if you don't invest in them, your relationship will just kind of fall apart. We see that all around us in our personal lives, let alone our professional lives. You have to invest in relationship. But I talked about segmentation before, and I talked about doing it at the goods and services level. If you do it before you actually commence any form of competition, it means you determine the kind of relationship you want, the treatment strategy that you want to put in place with that supplier. You embed that into the tender documents, into the competition process, and you're being completely transparent from day one around the kind of relationship that you're looking for with that particular supplier and what you're expecting from them. But also you're looking at your own organization to say, what are the capabilities, what are the behaviors, what are the people that we need in place to be able to manage that relationship effectively, and making sure that they've got the right level of commitment, the right bandwidth to be able to invest in that relationship. We're awarding contracts now for 10, 15, 20 years. you've got to get that right from day one. So it is so important to invest in the relationship, thinking about the kind of relationship you want, invest in that relationship accordingly, producing joint business plans that make sure that you unlock mutual value, because it's about value to the supplier, not just to yourself, and that you deliver against that. And using technology where you can see where there are some issues around innovation and continuous improvement, which tend to be the blocker to progress, tends to be client. 80% of issues, I believe, in relationships come back to client, not to the supplier. So you need that level of visibility so that you can attack that quickly within your own organization, overcome them, and give the supplier the right environment to succeed and unlock the value that you're actually kind of looking for. And the other thing is that people tend to forget about this, that most of your suppliers are actually buying goods and services on your behalf. Bring the supply chain director to your table, have that conversation, make sure that there's alignment between your supply chain strategy and their supply chain strategy. Don't just speak to the BDMs, don't just speak to the operational people, bring the commercial people to the table to make sure there's a continuum right down the supply chain. And it's such a simple thing, but it's something that people just forget, especially when they are in a, what should we say, a high stress environment trying to deal with problems and challenges. It can be such a quick and simple solution to overcoming some of your issues, would be my.
Thanks, Alan. Dan, do you think we overuse and underinvest the partnership? Do you think we overuse that term and not really fulfill our role, etc., or push a lot of it on the onus on the supplier?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, I think the analogy I draw is, if we think about the effort and energy and time we spend on managing our teams, if you have a team of 100 people inside an organization, that would consume a significant amount of a director or whatever level in an organization. I would be a very strong betting man to say I suspect we don't invest the same level of energy and time in a supplier that delivers 100 resources to us and delivers a key part of our operation. So I think we've got to get that calibration right, for one. I think the second thing, I do think we use the word partner too loosely, and then raise expectations within that third party, and then treat them like an arm's length supplier, and then it's all about cost. So I think we need to be very judicious about when we do use the word, and then follow through when we actually put them in that bracket, because it's you sort of only get that opportunity once to kind of set the tone of the relationship and get it right. And so you absolutely can't have that level of engagement and relationship with all your supply chain. So you need to be very focused, and Alan's mentioned a couple of times the sort of segmentation, and you need to be very thoughtful how you do that segmentation, and only a small group should have that elevated status, if you like, of partnership. But then you need to invest in it, you need to resource it in the same way that a supplying organization resources their sales team and their customer success teams, etc. We seem not to quite give it the same love and attention from our side of the fence. So I think there's definitely opportunity to do more there. But perhaps my counsel would be start small with a small number, prove it, what the value is, and then perhaps grow it when you've got a kind of tried and tested model.
Emma, can I just come in there?
Sure.
Dan raises a valid point, which is the word partnership. Even if you have a procurement organization and a leadership in procurement who really get it, it'll fail miserably if the culture of your organization don't understand partnership. Because we contract, we commercialize, we bring it into the business, but the running of those contracts on a day-to-day basis is your tech organizations, your marketing organizations, your logistic organizations. And so culture in the business has to be partnership orientated, and it has to start somewhere. So having a procurement organization that really wants to drive partnership, but I think Alan said it, you need to get your stakeholders or your client base really understand what partnership is, or else it'll fail, and suppliers will look at you as if you've been misleading them in this use of the word partnership, when the culture of the business is not behaving in a partnership model when the times get tough.
Absolutely, like operationalizing it outside of your own remit. And I mean, the sheer scale of the number of suppliers that you have, Patrick, I mean, how feasible is it to have that many partnership relationships?
Well, that's another point, which is, understanding transactional procurement and strategic procurement. But I'm in a very lucky position because, we source from over 70 countries. The culture of our business starts from partnership. What I mean by that is we buy vineyards, we buy crops, we partner with farmers, and we buy the herd, in the fish farm in Norway is a partnership there. And so the stem of the business, and it's not just for 1 year, you're actually laying down an infrastructure with a partner in Africa or New Zealand or whatever that lasts for multiple years. And so the relationships have to be in the good and the bad. When there's a drought in a certain country and the crop's failing, it doesn't mean we walk away. We have to dual source and find the alternative product, but we'll be back and helping them get the crop going. And so that makes the indirect side much easier, that the culture of the business stems from that longevity and medium sort of approach to contracting. But yeah, it's challenging, it comes down to individuals at the end of the day. And to your point, you can't have 5,000 partnerships, on a contract that's £70,000 and it's for 12 months, But you can enter the spirit of it, at least the spirit of it, with openness and treat people fairly and authentically. But the degrees of strategic, partnership, you have to be selective on your critical relationships so that you can put the energy, the effort into it, and it's long term as well.
Excellent, thanks. We've talked about technology a little bit, so I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more, and not just technology, other tools and levers really. So how procurement teams can make the most of these tools to drive cost efficiencies, and how that links into managing suppliers as well. So Alan, you touched on some bits of tech that you currently use, and please, by all means, because somebody has put a question in, that if you've got any examples of the tech you're using, please do drop them a mention. Yeah. Alan.
So tech is hugely important. I mean, it's giving you that window of insight into the resilience into your supply chain, enabling you to have the biggest opportunity to course correct if there are any potential issues, secure alternative sources, and make sure you get through the approvals, especially in a highly regulated environment such as nuclear, pharmaceuticals, food, etc. So that is so important in giving that information to your commercial teams at their fingertips and as real time as possible, just so that they can act on it. And from an SRM perspective, it's hugely important to have an enabling technology that underpins it and really embraces the value proposition that you put in place with that supplier. So it's tailored to it. You can switch the modules on and off. And that enables you, not just your commercial team, to look at the health of the relationship, where the opportunities are from an innovation perspective, how we're driving forward. But it also creates connectivity right up to the execs on both sides of the relationship as well. Gives them visibility of what's happening in that relationship, gives them easy to access reports. So if they're going into exec conversations, they're informed of where that relationship is. But also, and I'm sure everybody's suffered from this in the past, where exec to exec conversations happen, but nobody's aware below of what's been agreed, what's happening, what we need to focus on. That also provides that downward flow of information in terms of what are the key points of agreement that's happened at an exec level, what are the things that we need to be aware of, so we're not on the back foot if either party gets some information that the other party may not have traditionally had in terms of an exec agreement. So I think technology is absolutely invaluable to a successful commercial environment going forward. And as Daniel said, there's new disruptive technologies out there as well. I haven't got any insight into using any of those, so I couldn't actually have an informed conversation on here about it, but it's certainly something that we're starting to look at in terms of what are the new technologies that we need to look to engage with that take away the inefficiencies of my team, allow them to focus on more value-added activities, allow them to engage with the supply chain, look at what new technologies are coming on board. And the other thing that you need to be aware of when you're looking at technology is moving at such a pace. How do you set up your environment so that you can move from technology to technology on a shorter life cycle than we have done with our big, large ERP systems that have lived with us for decades?
Yeah.
So that there's some
absolutely. If you're not moving the dial, you're actually standing still, aren't you, in terms of this kind of tech? Yeah.
So some unique opportunities out there, but you've got to make sure your environment is set up for success to embrace them and get the value from them, would be my counsel.
Dan, you've been working with some smart tech companies, or have you seen some smart innovations that have been going on in this space?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, it's just a really exciting space. I think at last count, somebody told me there were over 4,500 different bits of tech just for procurement around the world, which is, eye-boggling, really. You consider you've gone to 3 ERPs 10 years ago, and now it's a kind of real smorgasbord out there. So yeah, I think that there's a real propensity around ESG. There's lots of interesting organizations trying to kind of crack that nut around how do we capture, report, surface and propagate good practice in the ESG world. So I'm working with a company called Collider, which is really good. Jason Roberts, really great guy. And then, particularly in payments, I think it feels like every organization over time is going to become a financial services company, because payments and transactions are going to be so crucial to everything. So I think that's an area which is going to get really exciting over the coming probably months and years. So look out for organizations in that sort of space. But I think just going back to the kind of core question for a second, I think digital does a couple of things for us. It makes us more efficient as teams and hopefully interactions with our vendors, which just should free up time to do the value added stuff, which is incredibly important. So I think that should be the primary business case for people to think about investing in technology. But the secondary bit, which often gets overlooked, is it gives us as a procurement team, procurement leaders, the kind of power, because now you've got data information to articulate hopefully what a fab job we're doing and why execs should take notice. So I think digital is yes, it's about making us automated and efficient, but more so it's about giving us real high quality information to push an agenda or get investment in our organization or get the spotlight on some of the things we're doing. So the reporting capabilities of our digital technologies are incredibly important for these to be successful.
Kate, how about you on the digital?
I think actually there's an awful lot of technology out there that's not built for procurement but can be used by procurement. So one of the things that we've been doing more recently is playing around with Microsoft Teams. So there's an awful lot of applications out there that can help you to gather information really quickly. I'm not suggesting that low code, no code is the right solution for everyone. And I know that, sometimes we want to buy something off the shelf because it gives us speed and agility. But one of the interesting opportunities that it has presented to us as an organization is really getting down into the detail of what data is it that we're trying to capture. And I think my only cautionary tale with digital, and I know we've spoken about ERPs, but also about, sort of end-to-end tech stack that comes from procurement, but also how far away that is from some of the innovations and the startups that are emerging now, is really being responsible for adoption and change management. Because it's not, to me, it's not good enough anymore just to have the procurement team to adopt that, but it's about what service that enables you to deliver to the business. And also potentially back to your suppliers, depending on what that is. I think it also provides a huge opportunity for improving supplier experience, which again makes us more attractive. And that can be, a real differentiator with ongoing relationships, but also tendering and sourcing new and fostering new relationships as well. Making ourselves as easy as possible to deal with really can be important, particularly in today's environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Ease of doing business, definitely. And someone made a point there about, will it actually free up procurement's time a bit more to focus on that more strategic thing? And I wanted to touch on that with you, Patrick, as well, because operating in such volatile uncertain times, it's easy to put some things to the back burner. And I guess ESG, sorry, is something that would perhaps be easy to do during these times. Have we shelved a sustainability agenda because we haven't got the time and resource to focus on it? I don't know. Over to you on that one.
Well, I think it could happen if you allow it to, but I think it can be quite the opposite. Personally, I try and lead on the carbon agenda. I lead the carbon agenda for Sainsburys in our own operations. So quite passionate about it. I think there's a win-win here that, we're all trying to reduce costs, reduce inflation. Well, there's no better way is to use less energy, for instance, as an example. And so by using technology to monitor your energy, et cetera, to reduce your cost, but also reduces your carbon footprint. So, there's a lot of things. Shipping, as an example, no, it's a very high cost item now at the moment, but it's a high carbon footprint. So you can maybe nearshore some manufacturing that has a lower carbon footprint, and the economics can stack up. So I think if there was a concern, it is that short-term inflation and our time doesn't allow us to do the more medium strategic things in the sustainability agenda. But going back to your point on technology, I think there's clever ways to achieve this as well, which is, platforms like iValue, Achilles and them who manage risk. But there's nothing worse than being a vendor, being asked by 15 customers the same information. And so tap into the platforms that have already asked the question, what are you trying to solve? We talked about technology earlier. Don't be chasing technology. Identify the problem you want to solve, and then look for the technology that will enable that solution. One of the most transformational things I did about 5 years ago, which is, I look back now and it's laughable, but bringing DocuSign into a procurement organization was transformational. People were running around trying to get contracts signed. People were running around trying to get sourcing approvals, 16 signatures. And now, of course, DocuSign allows you to send it, virtually, get the signatures. So don't chase the technology, identify the problem. And I think on the sustainability and the ESG, I think we cannot afford to put it on the back burner. And finally, I'll say this is a great opportunity for procurement organizations to lead this agenda. That doesn't come around too often. Yes, we're leading reactively on supply chain, on inflation, and we're at the front of the board and stuff. But this is one where you can lead proactively and really carve out what procurement, through your sourcing strategies, bring the carbon into the sourcing decision. And we at Sainsburys I have a little carbon calculator we've developed. If anybody wants access to it, I'll share it. It's a lovely little document that'll allow you to make carbon decisions across different supply chains as part of your sourcing. And so bringing that into the sourcing is the best thing we can do to help that agenda. But don't let it go on the back burner. However, I fear that for some it will have to, because they're under-resourced or there's too much pressure. But we can't afford to ignore it any longer.
Alan?
Well, in terms of build, the carbon agenda is front and centre for us. We're dealing with facilities that are 5-6 decades old, as well as building new facilities, and we're developing a 360-degree energy kind of paper, which looks at how do we drive down demand and make our aging facilities not just safe, but more economically viable and efficient from an environmental perspective, as well as how do we actually make sure that from a new capability perspective in terms of new buildings and assets, we've taken not just a strong look at life cost, but also the how to drive any energy efficiency into that to meet our carbon agenda. And then the middle part of that is, how are we actually going to generate energy going forward? How are we going to reduce costs and reduce our carbon footprint? Looking at potentially blended solutions around sun, air, wind, sea, and even small nuclear reactors. So we're going through that whole thinking to make sure that, when this situation hits us again, because it will, as it did in 2008, we're fit, we're healthy, we're ready, we can deal with it, whilst also making sure that we deliver against our energy and carbon strategy.
Kate, do you see these as conflicting things, like managing risk and ESG, or is it all just wrapped in together? Is this not something that you would put on a back burner because it's all part of the same agenda?
Well, ESG for us is absolutely paramount. We are investing very heavily in skills and capability as well. So people who can speak from a very informed position. I know we've spoken a lot about environment, but from a social and a governance point of view as well, I think, to be honest, that gives us the key to be able to manage resilience in our supply chain. Because if we don't, without the governance and without the understanding and the data and the technology to back it up, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't know what the true risk is. And so we can't tackle that together. So for me, they're hand in glove. I don't see them as separate agendas, but I understand, you know, there's been a move, hasn't there, recently around electric vehicles, certainly in some markets. Obviously, the knock-on impact to some of the raw materials and the commodity markets that we've got at the moment is creating instability in that market. But actually, what's the alternative? And it's really about looking at all eventualities and then coming back to what is the right thing and the corporate conscience of the business. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, though, Emma,
No.
to be fair. I think we will probably lead the way, as Patrick says, on muddling through it for a certain period of time. But luckily, we've been talking about this for an awfully long time in most larger procurement businesses. And it's again, I go back to suppliers. Do suppliers want to work with customers that are not aware and understand ESG and its full right, because they're investing heavily and they want to be able to work and create partnerships with businesses that are like-minded from that perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dan, quick comment from you before we move to a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'll just say I think it's absolutely paramount. I don't think you can neglect it. It's not optional anymore, and it is the thing that will differentiate you as an organisation if you get it right. So back to one of my opening comments, let's lean into it and kind of embrace it and get on with it, and perhaps together rather than individually. Maybe that's the way to tackle it.
Yes, no doubt. Okay, we've had a couple of questions. Both really around the Russia-Ukraine conflict that's going on at the moment. One around kind of, I guess it's difficult to estimate, like what the long-term impact of this could be, but I don't think we've perhaps seen the full effects in our supply chains. The shock waves haven't come through yet, and how long this is likely to go on. And then we had another question in the chat that's linked to it on how those counterterrorism and sanction lists are affecting procurement teams and of getting materials at the moment in your organisation. Patrick, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is I don't think the full implications. You know, there's certain commodities in the food sector that comes from Ukraine. It's such a high percentage that the downstream effects of that are yet to be felt. You know, if crops don't happen or if they don't get harvested, I think you'll find food inflation and availability of certain ingredients for many foods beyond comprehension as to some of these ingredients now that appear in most foodstuffs. So I think that's something that we're keeping a close eye on. I do hope, but I think it's a wishful thought that it's sooner rather than later that we get back to some form of normality. But I think there'll be a global response to Russia for years to come. I think, unfortunately for the Russian people, I think these actions are going to bring economic implications for probably a decade to come. Again, I hope that's not true, but I worry that anything to do with, I've had a number of contracts that were imminent for, I have to be careful what I say, but companies that had Russian influences in them, and we pulled out, and because consumer and colleague sentiment in our business would not allow us, even if we thought it was the right thing to do, it would not allow that to happen. So yeah, it's crystal ball time, but I think it is going to be, I hope it's sooner than later, but I worry that there'll be decade-long implications of, and mainly to the detriment of the Russian people, which we have to remember didn't vote for this to happen either. But unfortunately, they'll bear the brunt of most of it, I think.
Yes, absolutely. On that note, our thoughts are with everyone who's been affected by that conflict, everywhere, wherever they're based. Thank you so much. We're completely out of time. had another few questions come at the last minute. I did warn you to get them in nice and early, but we're absolutely out of time. So thank you very much indeed to Kate, Dan, Patrick and Alan for your insights. That was a really fascinating discussion. Like I say, we've recorded this session. We've popped in the chat the link to the previous session that you may have missed, so you can go back and watch that on demand on YouTube. We'll be recording this one and be circulating it as well. And also, if you'd like to sign up for our third session under this series with RS, then please do so. We'll send you all the details to that as well. So thanks to all our panel. Great discussion. Thank you for your time. And thanks for all the comments and questions that have come through from our audience. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us.
Emma.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Emma.
Emma.